Well, welcome everyone to week 5. Yes, we are actually halfway through the course, and tonight we'll be covering chapter 6, which is on risk identification. This is actually one of the, I guess, kind of the shorter chapters that we'll be going through. Actually, next week we'll be covering chapters 7 and 8, because also, at least on the risk treatment side, that one's a fairly short chapter as well. But tonight, risk identification. And what we'll be covering is, just as it implies, how do you identify risk, and some of the different techniques as far as doing that. So some of the objectives that we have for tonight are explain why an organization needs to identify risk and how it can do so. The next one, explain how an organization can use each of the following team-oriented techniques to identify its risks. We'll talk a little bit more detail about facilitated workshops, the Delphi technique, scenario analysis, HAZOP, which stands for Hazard and Operability Study, and then as well as a SWOT, which most people are familiar with, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The next objective, describe the purpose and the composition of a risk register, and then describe the purpose and composition of a risk map. Then finally, explain how an organization can use the following methods to identify loss exposures. So we'll talk a little more in detail about document analysis, compliance reviews, inspections, as well as consultations. And then the last part of the objectives is given a description of a business operation, recommend techniques for identifying and mapping risk. So just as we go through the last part of the chapter, there's a case study that is provided, and you'll have a similar type of scenario that you'll have to go through on the exam. And so we'll kind of walk you through a little bit that as well. So let's go and get started. Definition of risk identification. What are we really trying to do? Well, if you use the COSO ERM, event identification, you're looking at potential events affecting an entity's ability to successfully implement strategy and achieve objectives. Now, if you remember back from a couple chapters ago, really what ERM or risk management, the focus of risk, if we look at the definition, is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Everything really ties back to how does a risk impact the organization's strategy, or in this case, be able to achieve its objectives. We can identify tons of risks, right? You can say, there's lots of different risks that are out there, but that's part of the problem is you can identify a whole bunch. Really what the target is, how do the certain risks that you're identifying impact the objectives? There may be some things that don't impact it at all, and so it's going to be a little bit easier eventually when you start doing the analysis portion to say, okay, this one's not that big of an impact. And so as we go through tonight, you're going to see how you identify those and kind of quantify those, and part of that is the whole risk mapping aspect of it as well. The traditional definition, when we looked at risk identification, was to employ methods of identifying specific loss exposures that could interfere with achieving an organization's primary goals. So again, that kind of ties in at least a little bit to the objectives. But for the most part, when we identified risk, they're really tied to hazard risks. So again, that's where you see the word specific loss exposures. That's where that's coming into play. And so what we're really trying to do is the goal is to identify all known risks and attempt to identify emerging risks, as well as there's a little asterisk there, key risks. We want to identify those as well. Those are key risks are those with the greatest potential effect on the organization's ability to meet its objectives and should receive the most focus. So kind of going back what I just mentioned earlier, you can identify tons of stuff, but really what are the key risks that can be debilitating to an organization to make it not be able to operate? So some of the traditional tools when we think about risk identification are loss histories, right? And so for those that work in risk management or currently or safety and loss, one of the first things I typically go to is try to get an idea of what I'm getting myself into with a new organization is look at its loss history, get a loss run from the third-party administrator or from the enterprise or the risk management information system. And what a loss history does, it can provide qualitative as well as quantitative information, right? It's going to tell you how many types of claims are occurring, how often, the frequency, the severity of those type of claims. Contained in databases that can be adapted to various types of analysis, right? The idea of a loss run, if you're getting that Excel sheet or a spreadsheet, you can do pivot tables and all that kind of stuff. That's what it's talking about there. Hopefully, if it's we have the right analysis, we can the loss histories can be correlated with their effect on the organization's objectives, right? Um, and some of that loss history could be, how many people are out, like medical versus indemnity claims, which means if you're not having people able to work because they're getting severely injured, then you're not going to be able to be productive. So that can be part of that correlation. The one disadvantage of loss histories that they point out in the book is that it's a lagging indicator, right? What we're doing is we're looking at something that's already happened, so we can't really correct it. It's not an early warning tool. But typically, what we do know over a period of time is if we keep on seeing the same types of accidents, slip and falls, or cuts, punctures, those type of things on a regular basis, that means we got a problem, and we can then go forward to try to correct it. But we're not going to know if we're doing well until we get more data and to analyze it going forward. Some other tools, they're discussed in the textbook, checklists, right? And one of the things for the exam that you want to take a look at is, or kind of think about, is what's the advantages or disadvantages of each of these types of tools, and why and where would you want to use some of these, right? So a checklist, so one of the advantages of a checklist is that anyone can use it. It has a little checkbox, yes, no, did you see this thing? And it allows someone that may not have a background in safety or risk management and walk them through what they should be looking for, whether it be operational risks or specific hazard risk behavior, that people wearing personal protective equipment, or they're wearing, safety glasses, those type of things. That can be a way that you can identify some of the risks there as well. The downside of the checklist is it tends to limit creativity in identifying new risks, right? So if I'm going down, I'm pretty much going to stick to that checklist, and I'm less likely to go, ooh, I see that thing over in the corner. It's not on my checklist, and then how do I put that on my, my notes to identify that as a new risk that we should consider. Another tool, interviews and workshops, right? What I tend to do when I do risk assessments, I've done those for years for different organizations, and a large part of that is I use it. It's multiple using some of these things on here. I look at the checklist, I look at the loss history, but then I'm going to interview the managers and a lot of times the employees, and kind of get an idea of how their operations work, what's their process, their flows. Ask them point blank, what do they consider the risks that they have in getting their job done, whether it be from a workers' comp or if there's someone going to get injured from the public. Those type of things are some of the things you can use in an interview. The workshops is more of a plan. That's where you get more people together. It's more of a facilitated workshop that you're doing when you do that. Escalation and threshold triggers. So, and this talks about comparing current events or transactions to set criteria. And so what you might have is once you get over a certain number of injuries for every 100 full time, that can be a threshold trigger for you to start taking a look at a risk in particular. But basically all it's talking about is there should be some type of triggers or part of your identification. If you have all this stuff to look at, when do you need to take a closer look at a particular issue? Process flow analysis. We'll actually show a little bit later on tonight's class what that would look like. But essentially you're analyzing the processes within an organization from input to output. I think I talked last week about, if you're organization that relies upon getting raw materials from outside the country, and then it comes into a port, and then eventually you have distribution, you want to look for those bottlenecks, and you'll see that a little bit later. Audits, a lot of times people think of a checklist and it's similar to an audit, but essentially for practical purposes, an audit is really looking at what is required by either policy, regulation, or law, and doing a comparison and doing spot checks as far as that. So what you want to call a risk assessment or an audit. Audit's a little bit more formal process because you're checking against specific processes that should be happening. Computer software, right? So some of the tools that we have nowadays of computers or even handheld, there's apps that can help with doing inspections or risk assessment. So that's part of that. Team approaches to risk identification, which we're going to talk a lot more about this tonight. SWOT, Delphi, scenario analysis, and HAZOP are team approaches. And the idea is where these other tools, doing interviews, might be me doing that particular kind of identification. The team approach is to get people that have expertise in different areas. So maybe you get HR, you get legal, you get operations, and you try to take a look at a particular risk or problem and get input from everyone to get a better idea of, is this a real risk, or is this something that I'm thinking is will likely to happen, whereas in reality, from an operations standpoint, it's not that big of a deal. And then finally, emerging technologies and smart products. So this is something new that wasn't on the list before, that was added. But if you think about now, from risk identification, people wearing smartwatches, well, some of them, or Fitbits, they can, your heartbeat, temperature, all those type of things can identify areas where there might be potential risk, at least to injury to the person because of what's going on. Or there might be sensors within a warehouse to identify when there might be product spoilage, or when equipment may not be running properly. All these type of things can actually help identify risk early on. And then a large focus when we talk about look at risk identification is really having a holistic approach to risk when we're identifying it. And this is where the really, what I'll call enterprise risk has changed, or with the ISO and COSO, is to really have this holistic approach. And that really means breaking down the silos. And, part of when we look at that holistic and the tools that they talk about in here is to use the 4 quadrants that we've talked about in the very first chapter to help identify and categorize some of this risk, right? And it's going to help provide a framework for it. And the idea is that you can look at particular issues of how does that impact strategic risk, financial, operational, or hazard risk. When we go through the example here of Aerogen, you're going to see how this actually comes into play of really breaking down the silos and getting people involved. Now, it does talk about with that holistic risk process, right? When we start looking at the quadrants, the other thing they mention is, having a, who's involved and at what point. So the idea of a cascading hierarchy of, you might have senior leadership involved. And then you also have those, the bottom-up approach of, the operational people. And so typically what happens is when you do this holistic approach, you're going to have the top down, the senior leadership will focus more on the strategic risk, and the things that they look at are probably going to be quite different than what the line employees might be looking at if you use that bottom-up approach. And so really the idea is you really want to use both, right? And I think it does talk about in here, here's the figure. And as I mentioned before, when you look at the figures, you should be able to use these to help explain how you do risk identification, right? And all this is really saying is that, operational risk identification, strategic risk, you're going to have the different people help with doing that. And just remember that there's the 4 that are part of that. The other part of on the figure here is, what are the advantages of top-down, bottom-up approaches? That you really want to get both. And what that leads to, what this is showing is by having both, it's going to lead to that you're going to have critical risks identified, right? Those things that are important from a senior leadership standpoint are going to be identified and probably tied much more closely to the objectives of the organization. Typically, when you have that top down as well, you have a global perspective on the risk. It's not just your plant or your operations. Having the top down will help with that. Get a view of the top risks to the organizations, which, once the senior leadership helps identify some of the risks that they're concerned about, then operations can look at those and help align from an operational day-to-day standpoint. By doing both, you'll have improvement of a risk culture. And then the other real benefit of this is if we do it the right way, we're going to have prioritization of risk. What my experience has been, and others that I've talked to that have done consulting for years, is that we tend to identify lots of risks and we'll do these risk registers, and then we don't do anything with it. We don't prioritize of, what's the next step to make sure we actually address those risks. And the reality is when we identify 100 things, we're not going to be able to do all 100. And so the prioritization is really key. And that's why as we start going through some of these different tools and use some of the case study, I think it'll be really helpful for you. So team approaches to risk identification. So we've kind of talked about, from the objectives, what the, why an organization needs to identify risk. Now we're going into some of the different approaches from a team standpoint. And again, the purpose of the reason why they're focusing more on the team aspect is because it is going to help you with that holistic aspect to address the 4 quadrants. So one of the first ways to do this is a facilitated workshop, which are typically used for specific projects or processes, but can also be used to identify overall risks. So one of the questions I should back up here that you're going to have on the exam is it's going to give you some scenarios of the type of project that's being worked on or looked at. It's going to ask you which one of these team approaches would be the best use to identify risks. And so you have to understand just the basics of facilitated workshop, what it's used for, specific projects or processes, but it can be used just to identify overall risk. So it can be large scale of having a workshop of senior leadership and just having a discussion as part of that. The Delphi technique, what that basically entails is 2 rounds of queries to selected experts. And you're going to be asking specific questions. You can say, what's the biggest risk to the organization? You're going to ask those questions individually and get the information, then combine what everyone said, and then send the results back out and pose some of the same questions again with the new information to see if that changes their viewpoints. An example that was given, or at least that was done many years ago when I worked in the university, was one of the campuses. They did a study, the Delphi technique. They sent out a survey, and they basically said, what are the biggest risks that they perceive to the university? And what was interesting is a lot of them actually put, auto accidents and vehicle accidents and things like that. Well, then they actually they got the data and they kind of what everyone said, and it showed that vehicle was one of the biggest concerns. Yet when then they also sent the survey back out now with data showing that there's been very, very few accidents, and here's what other people have said, and then they ask the question again. And that's basically the idea of a Delphi technique. It's 2 rounds. You have people that are experts. You collect the data, and then you send it back out with the information. You see, does that change their opinion of what they were looking at? More cost effective than a facilitated workshop, because essentially you're doing a survey. You don't have to be in person to do this because it's individual, and you collect the information. And the C article is that part of the supplemental material, there's an article on the Delphi technique if you want more information on that. Scenario analysis, right? So scenario analysis identifies various risks and projects the potential consequences of those risks. A lot of times when we talk about scenario analysis, we're talking about what-if analysis. And just as the name implies, we say, well, what if this happened? What if this? And you kind of go through, and it's really good. It mentions about, with projects, it works out pretty well. And you say, okay, if this was to break, then what would happen? How would this derail the project? Or if we say we're building a large construction project, well, if our supplier goes bankrupt, how would that impact? If whatever goes on strike, would that have an impact? And you can do that. Usually involves cross-functional teams to analyze risk from different perspectives. And so that's where scenario analysis, you can take, again, actually an overall broad to the view of the organization, and say, okay, what are the risks of us not achieving our objectives, and get a viewpoint from legal, from HR, and everyone else in there. And that's where scenario analysis can be a great tool to use. HAZOP. So HAZOP is a hazard and operability study. It's a comprehensive review of a process or a system, and as indicates, primarily used to design complex systems in which failure is not an option, okay, and used for very large projects. So think about this would be the space shuttle, nuclear power plant, things like that. And so with a HAZOP study, you're essentially looking at each of the different, a process or system, and going through and looking at what could go wrong, right? And so as part of that, you want to identify, you don't want to have a leak or I'm trying to think of the right word here. Well, with the Challenger disaster and the space shuttles, right? With the seals leaking and those type of things. So all those things would come into play, and that's where a hazard operability study looks at that. And they have, they're huge binders, and sometimes several binders full that would be looking at all the different areas and what's the likelihood of something failing. When we do a HAZOP, basically would subdivide project or system design into small components. You'd review each of the component to identify risks, identify cause and potential outcome for each risk, and then hopefully part of this would be developing a solution for each risk. And so you might have a team using the space shuttle, right? You have a group of engineers working on the boosters, another one working on the O-rings, those type of things, looking at the different components and identifying potential areas where there might be failure and the causes, and then how to actually fix those to ensure that that doesn't happen. Last one, SWOT. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. I think most people by this time have probably done a SWOT at some point. It's a team approach useful in analyzing a new project or product. And part of this is you get representation from different organizational functions. So as I mentioned, each one of these, they have a specific use or purpose, and you'll get a question of which one would be best approach. And again, for SWOT, useful for analyzing a new project or product. If you were to go back and you say, okay, well, what about HAZOP? That's going to be a large product with critical, it's complex, used for really large projects. The facilitated workshop is something you can use really for anything. Identify overall risk. It's not specific to a small project. And then Delphi, it's more cost effective than a facilitated workshop, but you can still get an idea of reviewing overall risks as well. All right, and then here's the figure on the SWOT analysis. And again, this is just an example they had in the book. Nothing too elaborate there, but again, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And the main thing to know is when we talk about strengths and weaknesses, those are things that are internal. And when we talk about opportunities or threats, those are the external factors that you'd want to consider. Risk registers, right? So a risk register is basically, it's a tool developed at a risk owner level that links specific activities, processes, projects, or plans to a list of identified risks and results of a risk analysis and evaluation that is ultimately consolidated at the enterprise level. Okay, there's lots of word for what the risk register is, but just think about it. It's a large collection of risks that you're putting on a piece of paper. And what you want to make sure is that you include likelihood, the scenario associated risk with probability, consequences, and impacts. So the risk register is thinking about all those things that can go wrong, and then what does that mean from a likelihood and risk to the organization, and be able to take that. And then you might have one for a department, and you basically roll these up till you can get a risk register essentially for the entire organization. I do have links in here as well for UC ERM bulletins, and the reason why I put those in there, especially for those in higher education, excuse me, bulletins 11 and 12 deal with, they actually have a risk register and a matrix for higher ed, like some of the risks associated with research, or it might be some of the compliance risks, all those type of things. And it has the likelihood, and then as well has potential mitigations for those risks. So it just gives an example at a 50,000 foot level of what a risk register might look like, but it gives an overall view, at least for the universities, or at least for higher education setting. So going on a little bit more about risk registers, there is no right or wrong way to do a risk register. You can design it any way you want. The one in the book you'll see is one way, and if you go on the UC site, you'll see a little bit different way to do a risk register. But essentially, it's going to have these 4 elements, and this is where you'll typically have a question regarding risk registers on the exam. So it should adequately identify the organization's risks. It should also prioritize risk according to the potential effect on the organization. Provides interactive use for risk owners. What that means is for those that they can kind of say what's the likelihood consequence, they can adjust some of the factors there, and should form a matrix to manage the risks. So with that, you have this in your textbook, and this is going to be starting on page 6.14. And what you're basically seeing here, and this kind of looks all complicated, but hopefully it'll make sense, because I don't think that they do a good job of kind of explaining what's going on in here. So this is Aerogen's windstorm risk register, and this is for their Miami branch. All right, so obviously Florida gets hurricanes, and so having a windstorm risk register would be important. What they've done is they're only looking at this one risk. Right, so they're taking windstorm as a scenario that they're going to have a discussion about. The description is a storm damage, minimal to catastrophic, right, as far as the range of damage. Who are the risk owners? Risk management, regional and branch management. The likelihood of having a windstorm at some point during the year, right, most probably likely, 90% chance is what they're saying. The consequences related to that is that they could lose anywhere from 0 to over $100 million. The level of risk is a 10, which is the highest risk, which they've kind of got noted down here, the scale. In their improvement action, develop a catastrophe plan and review property insurance. And then they have a review date. Now, what you're seeing down here is the risk quadrants, and how this is when people take a different look at it depending on where they're at in the organization. So the first quadrant is hazard risk, right? These are the 4 quadrants. You know, when the description, if we have this windstorm, we might have wind damage, oxygen explosion, and fire. It says who the risk owner related to that, the likelihood in each one of these, and what the cost might be, and what needs to happen in order to fix them, safety procedures, safety plan for employees. Next, it's saying, okay, in this next risk quadrant, saying, let's look at the operational risk, right? Emergency disruption of medical supplies to customers. Now it's looking at what the impact, again, on customers from the objective standpoint. Loss of business records, period of repair or rebuilding. Again, what the likelihood of that, what's the cost associated, and what they should be doing to mitigate that risk. Financial risks, you know, credit risk, people can't pay, or the price risk, price of product may increase, so there's a risk there that they need to look at. So backup supplies from other branches, develop emergency payment plans for customers, and then strategic risk, reputational damage if customers cannot receive critical medical oxygen, and who this involves. And so basically what they've done now is they've created a risk register that is specific to just a windstorm, right? So that's one area that they've looked at. Now on the next slide, what you're seeing, this is on 6.15, is that now they're saying the windstorm risk register, it's an organizational roll-up. So now they're looking, here's one scenario, which is windstorm. Another area of risk that they have is a data breach. And then the next one down there looks like is rail strikes, right? So this, even though they still have windstorm, I think they need to fix that there. Okay, and they say, okay, the windstorm risk description, Cat 3 or higher. You know, who's the risk owners, the hazard risk, injury liability, business interruption. So it's taking all the risk quadrant elements, and it said based upon this, the likelihood here is a 40, right? They kind of took a change, but the level of risk is still a 10, right? And how much you're going to impact them, and what they need to do is develop a catastrophe plan with all stakeholders, review property and liability insurance. So that's just for the windstorm. And now they say for the data breach, the potential theft of customer information, IT partially owns this. Again, the likelihood, what's the threat? And then, you know, rail strike, less than only 25% chance. It's a low level, and you have a backup distribution plan. So this just gives you an example of how a risk register starts from one thing and slowly expands to include all other types of risks that are part of that. Now, what you do is you take this and you actually go to risk mapping, right? And so what we want to do is hopefully visually depict where some of those risks are. And part of this is really wants to display like likelihood and potential impact or consequences of those risks. And from a senior leadership standpoint, this is where it's helpful, because they would much rather look at the figures and say, okay, I can see red is bad, it's up in the high quadrant, and we need to address this, versus looking at all the data that we just saw on the prior pages there. So this is a basic risk map that they put in there for Aerogen risks. And so they've expanded this, right? So one of our risks was Florida windstorm, hurricane. This is also everything. So Midwestern windstorm. So this is the entire corporation. fire, explosion, potential vehicle accident. You can kind of see where all these things are. In the bottom down here, you're going to see that rare, unlikely, moderate, all the way to almost certain, and as well as the consequences being all the way to extreme. So the idea here is if we go up in this quadrant, a Florida windstorm, it's pretty much almost certain. They're going to have a windstorm or hurricane most likely at some time during the year or in 5 years, whatever your window that you're creating this risk register for. And same thing with a tornado in the Midwest. That's probably fairly likely. It could happen near their plant. And if it does happen, the consequences are fairly extreme. So you know something is probably going to happen. It's really bad. You need to develop plans for and help mitigate those risks. Some of these other things you can kind of see here. New computer system requiring staff training. Doesn't happen very often. If it does, it's negligible. Employee dishonesty, theft, those type of things. Unlikely, but it could. If it does, it might be medium risk. And that's all these things are, is just kind of looking at, the threat of, again, if it happens, it can be really bad, but then how often does it happen? Now, what they've done is they've also taken this, impact and time risk map. And I think in one of the prior classes, I talked about, time to impact and why that's important. Well, if you think about how quickly you can deal with some of these different issues, to address them, right? An earthquake, you barely have any time to address. So you got to do your mitigations much sooner. But like in this case, they said, even though Miami windstorm, it's fairly high, it's going to happen. The significance of consequences can be high, but from a time to impact, we have a little bit more time to prepare for that. Major acquisition, the high likelihood that's going to happen, and the impact consequences can be quite major. And then they have it in yellow, so it's not like a, oh my gosh, major thing, but the time from acquisition, you're going to have time to prepare for it. That's what this is kind of trying to get at is, moderate or least urgent to most urgent, right? And so there's nothing, okay, least urgent is reputation risk in some of these, increase in vehicle repair costs, those type of things. You're not going to have to do much on the exam dealing with a map or heat map, or excuse me, risk map, but they will kind of ask questions of, what should be included on it. And then finally, this last slide that they show, or figure in the textbook 6.19, talks about, kind of how you would want to address these things. So the idea is inherent risk. That means you're not doing anything. The risk of a windstorm, and this, for Airgen's Miami windstorm risk, if there's no risk treatment, there's exposure, 100+ million, then they have a reputational risk just off the bat by not doing anything. If they now buy insurance, so if they treat it by buying property and casualty insurance, that'll help that aspect of it. But they still have a reputational risk, and the exposures that they're buying about $10 million in insurance to cover it. So they still have some retention of some costs there. Optimum, current risk treatment, they're going to buy the insurance. The additional risk treatment is they're also going to do a catastrophe plan and have, do also reputational risk coverage potentially, and the exposure, 10 million possible premium reduction for improved risk control and reduced reputation risk. So this is just kind of showing the continuum. You do nothing, you treat a little bit of it, you treat more of it, and how you can basically help mitigate the risks that are on that risk register. So, got through risk registers and risk mapping. Now we're going to talk a little bit about identifying loss exposures. And this is actually a fairly short aspect, at least as far as this part of the chapter here, but so we'll go through it. So the 4 ways they talk about in this portion is document analysis, compliance review, inspections, and then expertise within and beyond the organization. So when we talk about document analysis, what does that mean, and how do we identify loss exposures? So a little bit different, whereas before we're talking about loss analysis, getting data, now we're just talking about looking at documents. And from that, you can use risk assessment questionnaires or checklists can be part of that. Financial statements, balance sheets, income statements, statements of cash flows. So one of the things that I tend to do when I do risk assessments, whether it be a public entity or a private, a little bit easier with the public entities, is I'll look at their budget documents, right? And the financial statements, I'll look at their annual budget. Now, for those in the public sector, you know that basically the budget lists your priorities and values. or they should reflect what the priorities and values of that organization are. And so part of that is looking at where are they spending money. A lot of times they'll say we want to open up a new park or those type of things, and that gives an idea of some of the exposures, or might be budgetary challenges with negotiations with various unions. A lot of the times you can find a lot of information in an annual report or within the financial statements. So by identifying some of the loss exposures, again, risk assessments, financial statements, looking at the balance sheets, income statements, cash flows, how is money coming in, how quick to pay. I'll give this actually for those in schools. When I served on a school board many years ago, one of the things that that most people don't realize is that the state of California is slow to pay. They were actually behind by almost a quarter. So almost every school district actually had to borrow money to basically make payroll because of the way that they were the state paid. And you could see this actually on the budget sheet. It kind of showed that there was borrowing occurring. I think it was near the end of the school year. They'd have to kind of float to make it until the next year. But those are some of the things where you can identify bottlenecks of liquidity and cash flows. That can be obviously a loss exposure, not being able to make payroll for your employees. Contracts. What contracts? Who are you contracting with? Who's your suppliers? All those things, again, can identify loss exposures, especially large contracts, and their ability to complete jobs, things like that. Insurance policies, right? Where you, again, this is somewhat making the assumption you're new to organization, you don't already know about the insurance policies, but getting an idea of where we bought insurance, why we bought insurance, how we actually utilized any of the insurance, have we actually had any losses. Organization policies and records, policies, procedures, SOPs, all those things can be quite helpful. Flow charts and organizational charts. I would say organizational charts, what the reporting structure is. Sometimes you can identify risks there. And then, as I mentioned, flow charts, we'll see some of those just as far as even bottlenecks as far as processes. And then lastly, loss histories, which we talked about before doing the loss analysis. So when I do a risk assessment, part of what I'm doing is I'm trying to identify risks. And pretty much I would say I use every single one of these documents. I try to paint a picture of where the potential losses are for that organization. And some I use a little bit more than others. But again, even like I said, the contracts, insurance policies, all these things come into play to help identify some of those. From a flow chart. So this is something I'm pretty sure they included in the book, or maybe I just kept it in there and they deleted it. But from a flow chart standpoint, this is where you might see raw lumber coming from South America, raw steel from China, and it kind of goes back to these two assembly plants in Mexico. This example they're giving, right? And so they make the product, and then they're going to bring that product, goes into a shipping container into the port of Los Angeles, right? And then it's going to get distributed throughout the rest of the U.S. from this one main port. Well, as you can see, they've got plants here, so if one plant goes down, they'll be fine. They have plenty of distribution centers. The main bottleneck is here. So, if I was to look at this as a risk manager going, okay, so if they go on strike, what happens, right? Or if we have the major fire, they have something that's going on here. So what is our backup solution to be able to bring product into the United States? So that, again, this is where flowcharts can be a good example of kind of help you identify things that may not seem obvious, except until when you do a flowchart like this. Some other ways to identify loss exposures: a compliance review. And basically when we talk about a compliance review, it goes beyond just looking at policies and procedures or internal documents when we're doing the document review. It's actually looking, are we complying with local, state, and federal statutes and regulations? And it could also be a compliance review of internal policies. So it's more similar to an audit. But you obviously want to make sure, if the laws say we're supposed to have provide certain type of training or have certain type of equipment, all those type of things, that can be part of that compliance review of identifying that loss exposure. Personal inspections. Again, when I do risk assessments, I go out, besides reviewing documents, I walk that that city or walk that property and the operations to really get a better idea of what's going on, to see what are they actually doing on a daily basis. What are the behaviors? Are people wearing proper equipment? Do they feel rushed? And part of that also is talking to the employees when you're actually doing some of those personal inspections. And then lastly on here, expertise within and beyond the organization. Basically that means way to do this is you can hire a consultant that deals with or that is an expert in that particular field to take a look at your operations, or they just might have enough background to be able to say, here's the things you want to look for in your organization. Part of, again, doing risk assessments, when I did do consulting, that's what I was hired to do. I was asked, so you typically go in and do a risk assessment. I'd go do all the document reviews, the inspections, compliance reviews, and do all that for them. And essentially that's where that expertise within and beyond the organization comes from. All right. So 6.24, educational objective, right? And this is the case study on how to identify risk. So what you're going to have to do is in here, it's given a description of a business operation, recommend techniques for identifying and mapping risk. You're probably not really going to have to map the risks because it's a computer-based exam, but it's going to ask you about where these things should fit, or how would you what would be the best technique to use, right? And so the case facts that they provide in here is that Ann is a new risk manager at Finder Incorporated, a global internet search engine organization, and her predecessor developed a comprehensive insurance program for Finder, including cyber risk, directors and officers, or D&O coverage, and employment practices coverage, in addition to their commercial property and general liability insurance. The chief executive officer, the CFO, and board of directors wants Ann to develop a holistic risk management approach. And after reviewing Finder's operating environment, Ann initiates the risk management process by identifying Finder's risk. And then it asks, what technique would Ann use in identifying Finder's risk? And so based upon what we know, some of the tools we have, right? Facilitated workshops, Delphi techniques, scenario analysis can be part of that. Some of the things we want to include would be hazard, operational, financial, and strategic risk. And what we're talking about in this case is not just on a specific project. They're just saying, let's identify all the risks in the organization. So, and then it talks a little bit more about identifying really from a team approach. This is not going to be a one-person job. So the question they pose is, which team approach would you recommend that Ann use along with a facilitated workshop, right? And the options are a Delphi technique, scenario, HAZOP, or SWOT. And the idea is, they're doing a facilitated workshop. So that means they're bringing people together and you're going to be asking questions. So they're already, spending the money doing that. So part of this, a Delphi technique doesn't make sense to probably do as part of that. A HAZOP is used for really complex and large projects. That's not one of those. A SWOT is typically used more for a project as well. So in this case, a scenario analysis would actually be, would probably be the best because it can explore the combination of risks that are part of that. It talks a little bit more. So some of the different things, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but what I encourage you to do is to read through that case study, and it provides the answers and why the answers are the answers, I should say, with there, and expect similar types of questions. This is what you're probably going to get on there, is something that's going to either show the graphs, and then you're going to have to answer the questions based upon that. So with that, we have covered all of chapter 6. Next week will be chapters 7 and 8. Look forward to your questions and hope you